Are they choosing an alternative form of suicide, which is driving into median barriers, driving into power poles, and are they not being counted in the statistics? We don't know, because we can't get that data from the police. The police will tell us that very, very often in single car accidents where there is no evidence of braking, there may also be a suicide note or something that can be interpreted as a suicide note, but those cases are rarely sent to the coroner and they're never classified as suicides. We want to find out. If, in fact, it is going down 19%, then that's fantastic. What are we doing right with young Pākehā men? But we just suspect that that's not the case. Female suicides is an issue of huge concern. As a percentage of total suicides from 1990 to the current day, you'll see that they're rising really steeply. We predict that that trend line is going to become steeper and steeper, and the reason for that is that young women attempt suicide and are hospitalised for serious self-harm at 3 times the rate that young men are. The reason that young women don't complete suicide or haven't historically is that they use less lethal means. So while young men are hanging themselves and killing themselves through carbon monoxide poisoning, young women have traditionally used cutting and ingestion of prescription medicines generally, which are less lethal methods and people can usually get to them first. Current trends are, though, that young women are using hanging and carbon monoxide poisoning. And if those young women who are attempting suicide at 3 times the rate of young men start using these more lethal, well, continue using these more lethal methods, then we're going to see a huge increase in female suicides. So we think it's critical that we pull that data out and start saying, what do we need to do? You know, do we need a tailored strategy for young women? Do we need a tailored strategy for young Māori and Pacific people? Do we need a tailored strategy for middle-aged men? You know, rather than an all-ages strategy that has a one-size-fits-all approach. Female suicides as a percentage of youth suicides is here, and of all ages. So where that line is going up around female suicides, it's young women, and increasingly young. As I said before, 100% of the young women aged 10 to 14 who killed themselves were young Māori women. So what do we know about people who kill themselves? 30 years ago, somebody was given permission to have a year's worth of coroner's files and to do a really intensive investigation about what was going on in people's lives when they chose to end their lives. And so those files looked at, had they been in the mental health system, were they having relationship issues or recent relationship breakups, were they under financial stress, what did their family say was going on about them, what did their friends say, did they have physical illnesses that might have contributed? And that data said that these are the things that are going on in people's lives at the time they kill themselves. Relationship breakups, number one factor that goes right across these files. Whether it's the middle-aged men that I talked about before who suddenly find themselves single at the age of 45 or 50 or 55 when their wife goes to university and the kids have left home or whatever, or whether they are 13, 14-year-olds who have fallen in love for the first time and been dumped and think that the world has absolutely ended. And when the chief coroner was asked on the radio recently, what is the leading cause of suicide in New Zealand, he didn't say depression or schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or any kind of mental disorder. He said relationship breakups. We also know that people under financial stress are often in those statistics of people who commit suicide. There's a strong subgroup of largely older people who are diagnosed with a terminal illness or a physical condition that they know means the rest of their life is going to be very painful and very difficult, and who make a decision that they don't wish to carry on. We also have people whose physical illnesses cause them to have changes in mood and behaviour that can also lead to suicide. And school and work stress is really low. But our government has adopted a medical approach rather than a social approach. On the advice of Annette Beautray, who is an American suicidologist, who said those who commit suicide should be portrayed as deviants with mental illnesses, and we should take a mental health approach to suicide prevention. I'm sure you can imagine, any of you who love somebody, and particularly if somebody you love has died, how it might feel to have your cherished child described as a deviant with a mental illness. And I'm not saying that there is any shame associated with having mental health issues, but a deviant? In the 16th century, people who committed suicide were hung in the town square. Their bodies were hung in the town square, and then they were dragged through and the bodies were abused. They were not allowed burials in churchyards because they'd committed a mortal sin and they were going to burn in hell. Their families had their homes and possessions confiscated from them, and the victims were buried at the crossroads. Some theory is that that was so that vehicles would drive over them and stop them rising again from the dead, and the other theory is that families buried them at the crossroads because while they were not allowed a religious burial, they felt that the shadow of the crossroads would give them God's protection. Now, when I turned on the television a couple of months ago and see Professor Ferguson, who's a colleague of Whangarei, saying that the one thing we must not do in New Zealand is allow parents who have had a child who commits suicide say, my child was deeply loved and was a wonderful, talented person. He said, we mustn't say that, because if we characterise these people as good people, then all the other kids will go and kill themselves. So we must say that they're deviants with mental illnesses. When New Zealand moved from a youth suicide strategy to an all-ages strategy, they spent an awful lot of money, the Ministry of Health contracting about 15 researchers to do a whole lot of work on what are the causes of suicide, therefore what are effective suicide prevention strategies. Of the 6 reports that they commissioned, 5 of them said this is a social issue. It's not about individual deviance. It's about unemployment. It's about the failure of our education system. It's about child abuse. It's about cultural beliefs or, whatever. And that's what we need to address. One report said it's about individual deviance and we need to diagnose them with mental illness and put them on drugs. And that was the one that the government adopted. So they developed a strategy that was about referring as many people as possible to mental health services, stopping media reporting on suicide, and reducing access to the means of suicide. Those are our key suicide prevention strategies in New Zealand. Now, what the evidence says about effective suicide prevention strategies, we know from the Director General of Mental Health in New Zealand, he published his annual report in 2008, and he said those under the care of mental health services are 20 times more likely to commit suicide than people not under the care of mental health services. Now, naturally, you look at that and you think, well, of course, because people under the care of mental health services are seriously mentally ill people. But he also published the diagnoses of the people who committed suicide under the care of mental health services, and only 18% were diagnosed with depression, 13% with schizophrenia, 11% with bipolar disorder. The most common diagnosis for 40% of them was other. Now, according to the manual, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the Bible of Psychiatry, other diagnoses include things like sibling relational disorder, not getting on with your brothers and sisters, mathematical learning disorder, not being good at maths, caffeine disorder, not being able to sleep well if you've drunk too much coffee, no longer being gay and lesbian. That was voted out of the DSM a few years ago, but you're still